So with that, I am going to speak no more and turn it over to Dr. Murray.
All right. Well, I'm back like a bad penny. You guys can't get rid of me. I think that's a problem here. This is our third thing. If you remember, the first one we did was in November. We talked about communication and language and the interaction between parents and children. In the second one, we talked about discipline, being a good parent, and discipline, and using the relationship as the basis of discipline. And today, I want to talk about the origins of the mother-baby relationship, which begins at conception. And I think you'll be surprised at how much that relationship plays a role in the baby's life based on just those first 9 months. A startling science has kind of arisen out of this whole thing. Oh, thank you. So we'll cover three things I want to be sure and impress on you, and we'll get these three things during this talk. One of them is how adult diseases, adult chronic diseases like heart disease and diabetes actually are programmed during pregnancy. So the fetus is very open and very what we call plastic during this time. And a lot of adult diseases have risks that are laid down during pregnancy. The second thing that we've learned is how the environment and experiences actually change health, mental health, cognition, and behavior by working and acting on genes. And this is a field of epigenetics. How many of you have heard of the word epigenetics? Have you heard people say that before? It's kind of a weird thing, and a lot of physicians don't even get clued into it. It's taken us a while to catch up. But epigenetics means above the genes, and it really is the environment acting on the genes that changes the development and the future of the baby. And then the third thing, what we've learned about the steps that we can do to create an in utero environment that actually protects the baby and optimizes the child's chance of having a healthy life. So Good4Growth, as I just mentioned, is rooted in this word relationship, because we now know, after a couple of decades of research, the power of that relationship between parents and child, or adult caregivers and child, to overcome many, many, many things in the child's life. It helps build the brain, it helps them with mental health and protects them from mental health problems. And it's based on this serve and return, this back and forth between the baby and the caregivers. And we talked about that first with language, where you just talk and the baby makes a sound and then you make a sound back and you try and get this ball going back and forth with the baby. We talked about that in discipline, where you actually draw out from the child a back and forth about their behavior and why it was either right or wrong, or things that they could have done better. But I think you can see in this circle here, serve and return is the basis of relationship building around everything: physical, emotional, linguistic, social, and cognitive. So it really is the direction that pediatrics is going now as it goes forward. The thing that's striking about what we're going to talk about today is how unique the first 1,000 days are. Totally unique in our life, in the sense that there's this explosive growth going on, physical growth, but also mental growth that's going on. And those first 9 months are the anchor on which the rest of it really grows out of. So it's a very unique time. We never do it again. We build our brain and we build ourselves physically, and we take on risk at this time unlike any other time in our life. So here's the first little law to tuck in your pocket, that the mother-child relationship begins at conception. And that really is rooted in the fact that the baby a lot is happening with that baby at that time, and the mother is coming into pregnancy with a lifestyle, and therefore creating a uterine environment in which that baby is going to grow and thrive. So we talked about this story before, but I'll go back and just remind you of it. There was a famine in Holland when the Nazis pulled out, before the Allies could get in there. And food was incredibly scarce for about 6 months. So there was a burst of time where there was almost no food available. And in fact, the daily rations for adults was 400 to 1,000 calories. Normal female would take about 1,800 to 2,000 calories. Pregnant female needs about 2,500 calories a day. So this was famine for this mother. And a lot of researchers from the US were very interested in what happened to those babies who were born before, just before, during, and after the famine. How did the famine impact the baby? And that was an unknown back in the 40s, and so a team of researchers went over and began to do the work. And they found, as you would expect, that that baby was born small. That child did not get enough calories. Mom didn't get enough calories. But they found also that that child, as they aged over the next few years, showed signs of brain damage that occurred during this time. So lack of calories actually led to poor brain development and poor school performance after that. This was the mystery, though. They found that those kids, as they got older in their childhood years, became overweight. So they started out very small and skinny. They didn't have enough to eat. And they ended up small birth weight, but they got obese over time during childhood. Well, they followed these kids out, and another set of researchers went back, tracked all these kids down 50 years later. So now they're getting up there. And they looked to see what kind of diseases this group had relative to other kids born before the famine when food was plentiful, and after the famine when it was gone. And what they found is a lot more different diseases than they ever would have suspected. And these were big chronic diseases: trouble with their blood sugar, cardiovascular disease, stroke, blood pressure, kidney function, pulmonary function, asthma, and other pulmonary diseases were common, emphysema and the like, and also cancer. So big diseases, the ones that really plague Western civilization, actually were worse in kids exposed to famine. Fascinating set of findings. It sat there for decades until the researchers began to pull at this and say, what's going on here? Why are these kids at such risk? Well, what happened was a couple of decades of research, and all the different researchers started to really look at this question with animal studies, human studies, and then studies that look back at different situations. And what they found is whether or not it was too little calories, famine, too much calories, obesity, which we've seen in the last 20 years in the US, or unbalanced calories, in other words, enough calories but poor nutrition, nutrient deficiencies, it didn't make a lot of difference. They still all had effects on the growing fetus in terms of its cells and then the tissues and the organs, the communication between them, and depending on timing and intensity, this had a tremendous effect on the growth of the baby, on the development of the baby, and then on the future diseases that that baby had when they were an adult. So it was a strange thing. The child's exposed to this in fetal life. They may have a perfectly normal appearance at birth, but as they get older and their body starts to tax the system, they show signs of chronic disease because organ, tissue, and cell function has been permanently changed by a nutritional imbalance, whether over or under nutrition. A fascinating set of findings. Here's a study, and I like this study because it's so clean and it's so easy to understand. This guy he was a kidney specialist named Brenner, and he wanted to know what's the origin behind what's called glomerulosclerosis, and that's a big fancy Latin term for the little kidney cells scar down and die. And as a result of that, as they die, people get hypertension. The kidney simply can't function, and they get hypertension. You want to know what's the nature of this? He looked at some of these fetal studies, and he decided to do an experiment. And he took rat mothers, and he fed them a very low-protein diet. What was unique about this, when I read it, was the calories are right. They got the same number of calories they should have gotten. Not a famine, not obesity, right on the money for what the mother needed. But the protein quality was poor, and he made it up with fats and carbs. What he found is that the fetus adapted during development to this low protein. And when he looked at the kidneys in those babies when they were born, the kidneys were small. And they were small because the number of nephrons, the number of kidney cells, was decreased. But everything was fine. Kidneys worked fine. They were doing their job. But he said these decreased number of kidney cells began to show signs of trouble as the child aged, as that little rat pup got older. Each cell had to work harder. It began to exhaust give out, scar down, and die. And as a result of that, as they died off, the blood sodium began to rise and the kid's blood pressure went up as an adult. So something happened in pregnancy, normal looking infant, everything goes fine, but in adult, the cells begin to wear out and the child begins to show chronic hypertension in adulthood. Very clean study, only because of protein. So what happened from that point forward is a lot of studies started to be done, and they realized that nutrition was one powerful force, but there was a lot of other powerful forces that did exactly the same thing to this developing fetus. It might be diet and it might be weight, over or underweight in terms of maternal weight, but it could also be blood pressure problems, illness in the mom. She gets an illness at exactly the wrong time when the heart's developing, heart disease results. Smoking and alcohol, you know that story now, and that's something that we've kind of written over the last few decades. But the impact of smoking and alcohol is permanent change in fetal development and brain. Toxins, drug effect, chronic diseases. And then a big one that's come along in this country, right alongside of obesity, is gestational diabetes. We're seeing record numbers, epidemic record numbers of gestational diabetes and obesity in pregnancy now, and it has an effect on the developing baby. And this is what they've found from those studies. A lot of different stresses come at the mother, and they have effects to program adult diseases in these areas: obesity, cardiovascular disease, stroke, diabetes, big metabolic diseases. But one that was very interesting to me when I started researching this about 5 years ago is mental health disorders also are programmed in the baby. So when mother is facing a lot of mental or physical stress, she translates those big cortisol, all those stress hormones, translates into the developing fetus, and the developing fetus is prone to mental health problems and stress disorders as well as they grow up. So this environment that mom has around her, the baby has around it as well, and it really does change their development. How does that happen? You know, I first heard this theory about fetal origins of adult disease back in the 90s, and I could not figure out how is it that this little baby sitting there in utero and then as an adult shows these signs of disease. And it turns out this is where the field of epigenetics really came from. What happens is the genes that we have are tucked away in the cell here and in the nucleus of the cell. And the DNA that's in there doesn't change. It makes proteins. That's what it's coded to do. And it makes proteins to signal the rest of our body. What's interesting about that is that we have about 20,000 genes. So not a ton of genes. We got 20,000 genes. I was saying this morning, the water flea has 31,000 genes. And the most genes of anything on the planet is Paris japonica, which is a plant. So it doesn't take a lot of genes to run an organism. We've only got 20,000, but those 20,000 run billions of cells and regulate everything about them just from that one packet. So how does that all happen? Well, the DNA makes proteins under the direction of RNA. And what they found from these studies is that the environment, the epigenetic environment around the mother and around the baby, changed the way that the DNA turned on or turned off. So I've got this packet of code that makes proteins, and I've got these epigenetic forces that can turn on that or turn off that protein. Depending on what it is, how much is made, it changes everything about the development of the baby, the organs, the tissues, how the cells work, and how they communicate. So genetics tells which proteins the DNA is capable of making. That's from mom and dad. But the epigenetics is which proteins, when, and how much are formed. And that changes everything for the baby. That still sounds a little weird, doesn't it? That the biochemistry here is enough to make a difference. But here's how you need to think about it. If you look at chess, you have one board, you have a set number of squares, you have a set number of pieces, and they're restricted in their movements. This should be a pretty simple game. You know, I got one board, I got the same, it's like checkers, right? Except in this case, even though you've got that, depending on how the pieces are played, what sequence they're played, and what other pieces are played in response, the response to those, you can have an infinite number of possibilities. Small number of pieces set board infinite possibilities, and that's exactly what happens. The DNA is sitting there, it doesn't change, but our environment, our experiences, our social experiences alter the way that DNA functions, and it's like a game of chess. It can go any of a number of ways from the beginning, all possibilities. So it's an interesting finding. The word epigenetics was not even talked about 20 years ago, and all of a sudden it's an entire field of science that's really looking at the impact of our environment and our social world and how that changes the way that we function. So genetics is one set of genes, but epigenetics is many possible outcomes related to that. And the uterine environment is the first and a very powerful environment for this developing fetus. So what does it mean to be a mom? It's not the same to be a woman and to be a mom. Something happens when you cross the line and get pregnant, and a lot of things change. Happily for all of us, nature has taken care to make sure that we take this job seriously, because there's a lot on the line for this baby. So if you become a mother, once you're pregnant, a lot of things have to happen for the survival of the baby. You've got to be sensitive to this infant. You can't just ignore it. You have to be emotionally attuned, highly motivated. You have to be responsive. And being responsive to a squalling baby at 3 in the morning is not fun. But to a mother, it's primed in the mother's brain to respond to that baby and take it seriously. You have to be very empathetic to what this child needs, tune into the cues. You have to be rewarded. You've got to be able to get something back from this baby. If you don't get something back from the baby, there's a real problem with taking care of this baby's needs. And in fact, Andy Garner is going to be here later in the spring to talk about maternal depression. And this doesn't happen in maternal depression, and it really sets up a difficulty in that relationship. You have to be restrained in your response. You can't over-respond and be frustrated and angry all the time. But most importantly, you've got to fall in love with this baby. The baby depends on mom falling in love with it in order for it to survive and thrive. How does that happen? It happens because when you get pregnant, thankfully, this biochemical tsunami occurs, and you're flooded with these different hormones, such as prolactin and oxytocin. And it doesn't just set the mammary glands and the uterus up for the baby. We always kind of talk about this like priming for the baby so that the pregnancy is protected. But it also changes our stress hormones. It changes everything about the physiology of the body, and it also changes the brain. I don't mean it's just a little chemical response. This isn't like a pleasure center or something kind of thing. It changes the wiring of the brain and the way the brain communicates. A dramatic shift in the chemistry in the blood and the wiring of the brain. And so what happens is those pathways that we have for emotional control and behavior, mood, anxiety, stress, impulse control, focus, and attentiveness are greatly heightened in the pregnant female, different from the female before pregnancy. And interestingly enough, when they look at some of these things like empathy and emotion and other things, and memory, those things are highly sharpened during this time for the female. Maximum time when this works most intensely is the first 3 months of life of the baby. As you know, if you've ever go through that, by the time they're 3 months old and they're smiling at you, I mean, you're very, very much in love. And all of these things are on full tilt. So I want to go back to this study and just talk about it for a second. Remember, we talked last time when we talked about discipline and other things that how a baby rat, a pup, was nurtured very much changed its reaction to stress. And that's kind of what I was saying to you before, that mental health disorders actually can come out of this during pregnancy, depending on how the baby experiences stress and how mother experiences stress. But what they did in this study was they would take the babies out every day and they'd weigh and measure them, and that was a huge shock to the system for these babies. They were taken away from the cage, taken away from their mother, and they were handled by this giant, and then they were put back in the cage. Some of the mothers were high mothering types, very nurturing. They rushed over, licked their baby, calmed them down, and they found actually when they drew their blood that the stress hormones in the baby dropped right back down to normal because mom was giving them the hugs and the attention and the love. But there were other mothers that just were not naturally mothering types, and they didn't come over and do anything for the baby. Baby got stressed, and that stress stayed high. And that child ended up very different. The rat pups who got well mothered showed greater exploration. They were more curious about their environment and very confident exploring the environment. They were socialized, they were healthy, they were less anxious, they were less aggressive, they grew up better, they were much, much better in the social environment. The ones who had low mothering were just the opposite. They were antisocial, irritable, poor in a group, and sick, and as they got older, they became sicker and would tend to die younger. But that was only part of the story, this first part of the story. They did a lot of experiments on this, and they followed these rat pups as they got older. And what do you think happened to those mothers, the pups of the mothers who didn't get attention when they were young? When they became mothers, they didn't give attention to their kids either. High mothering pups were high mothering mothers when they got pregnant. And low mothering pups, so one of the ways they tested this out was by switching mothers on these babies, and they found it was not the genetic thing. It's not passed on in the DNA. It's the act of nurturing that gets passed on generation to generation into the DNA, into the control of the DNA of these little pups. This was the first set of experiments among many that have shown that some of these epigenetic effects can cross generational lines and get passed down and become a permanent part of that person's makeup and personality, and it's passed down to their child as well. And that's a very scary thing. If you think about a trait like poor mothering, that can be a problem for that child when they become a mother. And it requires us to be much, much more attentive to those mothers to make sure that they develop a new style of mothering. So how do you make a healthy baby? Well, now that we know all this about the environment and things, that one of the key targets that we have now is making sure that that uterine environment and the environment around mother is actually as health promoting as can be. So to make a healthy baby, you want to make a healthy mom first and make sure that you tackle those problems around her. And here's the problem that we've got. Before you realize you're pregnant, there's a lot of stuff going on, and it starts at conception. So if you figure out by 8 weeks or so that you're pregnant, that's great, except the neural folds that make up the brain and the central nervous system, the head, heart tubes, eye vessels, limbs, all of that stuff is forming, and you're deep into it by 8 weeks along. So it's not enough to suddenly get religion and say, well, I'm gonna change my behavior once I know I'm pregnant. You know, the baby's experiencing your behavior from the get-go at the beginning. How many pregnancies are unintended, by the way? Any idea? You know, we always talk about, oh, like family planning. We were terrible at this. I would just tell them. You know, we had our third kid. Whoa, a surprise. That was from a doctor and a nurse. Way to go. It's 50% are unintended. So a lot of pregnancies that occur in this country are simply because of failure to use contraception effectively, as you might imagine. But 50% occur without us being planned. So if young women come into pregnancy with poor lifestyle, poor diet, poor physical fitness, you know, they drink, they smoke, they do all this and say, well, I'm going to fix that once my husband and I decide to get pregnant, not a good time to decide to change your lifestyle. You want to be ready for that, and it's kind of an important piece of this whole thing. So this is a fun story, I'll tell you, from the world of fish. This is the power of epigenetics and the speed of epigenetics. I wanted to show you this. So they did this little experiment. So here's African cichlids, and you can see on the right, there's a typical African cichlid, and they're relatively small. And on the left is the kingfish himself, the head of the whole school, and he's bigger, has bright red coloring and orange coloring and all this kind of stuff. So he's big and bright and flashy. Well, they did this little experiment, and they, in the middle of the night when it was dark, took the kingfish out of the school. And when they did that, the number 2 fish, male fish, suddenly realized that the big guy was gone and he was next in line. It only took that fish 12 hours to gain 20% bigger body and flashy colors like that in 12 hours. Now, I know you're going to say that's water weight. Okay, it's water weight for sure. But he felt like it was the real deal, and the other males didn't know, so it doesn't matter if it's water weight. But he looked, you know, this change occurred so quickly that it really drove home to me the fact that when you enter pregnancy and you're not in control of your lifestyle, that a lot of stuff can happen, is happening, and it can occur very, very quickly. Those epigenetic things don't take weeks and months to happen to alter the DNA response. It happens right away, really dramatic changes. So even before conception, the best thing is if all young women, 14 to 40, adjust their diet quality, take that role extremely seriously, become physically active. You don't want to enter pregnancy with nutrient deficiencies because you just saw some of the impacts of nutrient deficiencies on the baby. And the 2 big ones that we have are iron and folic acid. Folic acid is, you know, of course, we've supplemented folic acid in a lot of our grains in order to make a better exposure in the population. And it's done a very, very dramatic job of putting more folic acid into women and cutting the risk of spinal cord not closing. It's called spina bifida. But that is an early effect, really early, like the first few weeks. So if you come in folic acid deficient, the baby takes the risk. It's not something you can fix later. You want to fix blood sugar problems, and that's becoming a bigger and bigger problem. Stop alcohol and tobacco, obviously. Stop unnecessary drugs if you're going to get pregnant. And then vaccinate, prepare to protect yourself from infections like the flu. And then the last thing is improve weight status, because this has been shown to be an enormous epigenetic force on the baby. One of the ways you do it is you begin the job of taking the diet seriously. So when you do become pregnant, all meals and snacks should be planned. That probably should be the case for all of us, but we tend to extemporaneously decide we're going to eat in the car. But for a pregnant female, this is something that really requires planning. Eat breakfast and then eat every few hours. Balance proteins, complex carbs, and healthy fats. Real food. A vitamin supplement is how we do it in this country. Overseas, they go after iron and folic acid as the only 2 that they actually use, but in this country we tend to use a multivitamin because we probably have a lot more going wrong than we think we do. And then you limit these types of things, and you've heard those messages over and over and over again. Finally, a lot of fluid. Your blood supply goes up like 125% during pregnancy. You're supplying the baby as well. It takes a lot of fluid to be pregnant. Are you eating for 2? I always love that. People say, oh, you're eating for 2. Not really. At the end of the first 3 months, end of the first trimester, the baby's about 2 inches long, about the size of your little finger, and weighs about a half an ounce. So the baby's not keeping up their end of that eating for 2 thing, just so you know. You do need that extra calories. You need about 300 to 500 extra calories. That's like an additional meal a day. But it should be very high quality nutrients, and it should mainly be in the 3rd trimester. It's really to support tissue, maternal tissue growth, and the baby growing at a very, very rapid rate in that 3rd trimester, and they're taking on a lot of body weight at that time. So you have to gain the appropriate weight, and this is how it's being done now, much different from, it used to be just a flat number, 25 to 30 pounds, everybody. But now they're starting to look at this risk in terms of maternal weight and risk on the baby and on the pregnancy and on the mom. So they've changed that, and they now say body mass index. If you're underweight, then you have a body mass index under 18. Normal weight is between 18.5 and 24.9. overweight, 25 to 30, and obese. Depending on your BMI, it will determine how much weight you gain in your pregnancy and how many calories you are allowed to eat. So it makes a big difference if you come into pregnancy overweight or underweight, then they're going to make you adjust that during pregnancy to help the baby. And here's what it looks like. It could be that you're asked to gain as much as 40 pounds of weight. Oh, that's a party, just saying. So 40 pounds of weight is if you're underweight, they want you to gain a lot more weight to protect your own body because you're carrying this baby with a lot of tissue change. If you're overweight, they're going to want you to gain as little as 15 pounds, a really hard assignment for anybody during pregnancy. And for people who are already at a lot of risk with extreme obesity, they may ask you not to gain any weight at all. That's a very rare thing, but that's something that some obstetricians are moving toward, even less than this. So a real challenge there, depending on whether you're overweight or underweight, as to how you gain weight. But it's really important to the baby's outcome and the pregnancy's outcome that you gain this weight. Here's why. If you're underweight and you don't gain, or if you don't gain enough weight during pregnancy, you risk having a small baby, and you risk having that baby have all kinds of problems with prematurity. Prematurity rate in this country is very high, about 10%, here in Ohio, 10% for whites and about 14% for African Americans. So a lot of prematurity is because of poor nutrition. The second thing is if you're overweight, you tend to have a big baby, and that drives the C-section rate. C-section rate is a whopping 1 out of every 3 births is C-section delivery now. And a lot of that goes back to gestational diabetes, high blood pressure, and weight gain that occurred before conception and during pregnancy that puts the pregnancy at risk, puts mom at risk, and puts the baby at risk. C-section deliveries have a lot more problems. So it's really important that you follow those things. Where does all that weight go? Nobody ever talks about this. They think, hey, wait, the baby's only 7 or 8 pounds, and you're gaining all this extra weight. Where is it going? It's critically important for mom. You're putting a lot of different things into maternal tissues and maternal production of blood, and your heart rate, your heart's bigger, your heart rate's faster, everything about your metabolism is stepped up. It's an enormous physical task to be a pregnant mom. You're really changing your entire physiology to adapt to that little baby and create that uterine environment. So to optimize that, you really want to make sure you hit your weight target exactly right, high quality nutrition, and you take that very, very seriously during pregnancy. And then all women should be doing this, particularly young women, even well before pregnancy. They should take care of themselves. And to do that, they really need to have regular MD visits, manage any illness. And 2 things I want to stress here. Stress management for pregnant females and quality sleep. We get shorted. You're going to get shorted after the baby's born, for sure. But even beforehand, it's really important that you keep your stress down. And one of the ways you can keep your stress down, a great way, is stepping up and being physically active. And they're not talking about going to the gym. They're just talking about walking. Just get out and walk every day and do some brisk walking all the way through pregnancy. Recognize if you have problems with depression and get it treated, because that can really impact the baby after birth. And then everybody needs to get support. I think that's an important thing. You're going to hear from Pat Gabby talking about moms-to-be, and moms-to-be really focuses on these things for the pregnant female to get a good outcome for mom, good outcome for pregnancy, and a good outcome for the baby. So here's the message I want you to just take away. Our experiences, social and physical experiences around us, change gene expression. And when gene expression changes, it changes the biology of our body. Everything about it changes, not just the physical aspect, but the mental aspect as well. It then changes our behavior, and over time, it changes who we become. So we think of our body as being a separate entity in space, but actually our body is porous, and all the things that happen to us go right through to all the cells of the body. And if you're growing a baby, it goes right through to the baby's cells in their body as well. A really fascinating outcome of epigenetics. So do we have time for questions? Okay.